I am Robert Baldock, and I am a publisher at Yale University Press, and I'm here as someone who helped organise the day. And I'd like to, before we get on to the main session, welcome you very warmly on this glorious summer day, Wimbledon weekend. Thank you very much for coming. Several people have come from a long way, and 3 from Canada, and I'm deeply grateful to you for making that journey. I just wanted to make a special thank you to our hosts, Birkbeck College and the Peers Institute, and specifically Professors David Feldman and Daniel Pick, who have facilitated this. And thank you very much, David and Daniel, and their staff, Johanna, who is outside. But particular thanks, of course, to Marina, Norman's widow, although widow sounds a curious word, who is clearly the inspiration and the driving force for this occasion. Norman Cohn died 5 years ago this month.
Yes, on the 31st.
And he wasn't a man of religious faith, although he spent all his life thinking about, writing about, studying other people's faiths. And so he had no conventional acknowledgement when he died. And Marina said to me that she regretted that and wanted something not so much to, as closure, because clearly in terms of Norman there will never be closure, thank heavens, but something to mark his achievement and his work. Hence this colloquium. And I'm not quite sure how we call it a colloquium, but it suggests that you will speak in Latin. And I think probably only Jinty could do that, and probably also Norman. If this was the British Academy, it would be called a conversazione. But I think we should just have a discussion, really. A couple of practical points first. This is a very informal event, and the presentations will be relatively informal, and that's what we want. We've organised it around the 3 principal books, but that is no more than just to get a sense of chronology of the life. The speakers within those categories will range widely, and so there's no need, no one should feel sort of restricted. We're clearly very fortunate in our range of speakers today, and it's a pity we need to hold them and you to essentially to a 20-minute presentation. But we do want to enable people around the table to contribute and to say things, and so if we can sort of keep to that timing, that would be an advantage. In the 4th session, which is very open, and Michael Bryant will share it, there'll be an opportunity to catch up on things that people feel haven't been dealt with sufficiently earlier in the day, and to talk about Norman more personally. Since I haven't put any name tags or anything, it's probably a good idea if the first time you speak, you identify who you are. In the materials on before you, there is a printed program, and I apologise for the fact that the only photograph we have of Norman, he's looking a bit orange, and the one thing Norman wasn't was orange. A list of the participants. Biographical details of the speakers. Forgive me if I've got everything wrong. And a page of memoir from Sir Michael Pepper that Lady Pepper has brought, and I think we'll read that out later on in the day. There will be a light lunch brought in at 1 o'clock. There are drinks and things to help yourself with as and when you can. I ought to say something about the toilet facilities. Because this is the master of the college's territory, it's well protected. And Johanna has a key to enable you to go out the security door and find the facilities in the reception area. I hope that will work well. I think that's all I have to say, except something quite nice. William Lamont saw Asa Briggs, was it yesterday?
Yesterday morning,
And Asa, of course, was Vice-Chancellor of Sussex at the time that Norman was there at the Columbus Centre. And Asa, who is 91 or 92,
91.
And we are told has written 2 books in the last year.
Yes.
He sent a very nice message. He said, I'd love to have attended this colloquium in which many friends are taking part. I was glad through David Astor to get Norman to Sussex. So it's a very nice little message from a contemporary. I'm going to hand over to
I'm John Arnold. I'm a professor of medieval history here at Birkbeck and current head of department, and another welcome to Birkbeck, although it's very much Daniel and David Feldman and Robert's show. David Feldman reminded me, given that one theme we might be discussing is the kind of embedded sets of visual and sort of psychic associations, I invite you to admire the portrait of Tessa Blackstone on the wall back there, remembered as Master of Birkbeck with some mixed feelings, ambivalence, and one notes the sort of slightly horned visual motif that we note every time we're in this room. We're looking at the pursuit of the Millennium to start with. You can see my very well-thumbed copy, and indeed Europe's in the Demons, a book of considerable importance to various areas of medieval and early modern history, and of course interesting and in a way something that we still aspire to, of trying to bring together conversations that stretch beyond our received periodisations. Our three speakers are going to speak for about 20 minutes each. I'll introduce all of them, all three, now. I'll keep them more or less to time, but without being unnecessarily brutal, and then there'll be a chance for other thoughts and discussion at the end. So in a moment, our first speaker will be William Lamont, who is Emeritus Professor of History from the University of Sussex, whose research is focused particularly on the religious dissent in the early modern period, and I can remember the book on the Muggletonians that was probably a while ago in what sense now, that sense of religious concern. Dame Jinty Nelson, Emeritus Professor of Medieval History at King's College London, a medievalist of capacious grasp and interest, but amongst them fantastic historiography on medieval heresy and other areas of interest, and a great sense of what it is that medievalists and historians in general ought to be trying to do and attempting to do. And our last speaker is Lorenzo DiTommaso, who is Associate Professor at the Department of Religion in Concordia, University, Montreal, and Lorenzo's work focuses on millenarianism and apocalypticism in a variety of ways, and therefore obviously also speaks very much to our theme. So I turn now.
I want to say that I have always felt a bit of a fraud, and perhaps at the end of this 20 minutes you'll say, why the little? But the truth is that the Independent asked me to write an obituary notice, and I wrote back. I thought the clinching refusal. I said, but I never met Norman Cohn at Sussex. And in fact, I only met him once at Oxford, so I thought that was the end of the story. But it wasn't, because I'd suggested other people. But anyway, they came back to me in the end, and I began to feel it's like the end of Some Like It Hot. That you remember Joey Brown was being wooed by Jack Lemmon, and Lemon eventually tears off his wig and says, "I'm a man." And they say, well, nobody's perfect. Well, I just felt like that. When the Independent came back again, I felt like that only by tearing off my wig could I carry on. But my interest in millenarianism meant that I was a very devoted follower of Norman Cohn. But as I say, I would meet him once at Oxford. So many of you have much stronger claims to be talking about him than I have, except that my admiration for him was genuine, and I think it's a remarkable book. Cohen became a historian almost by accident. At his school in Gresham's, languages were much better taught than history. It was on a languages scholarship he went to Christ Church, Oxford in 1933. He read French as a single language and specialised in the Middle Ages, happily for us. Uniquely at that time in the modern language school, he was awarded a scholarship to read German for another 3 years. In 1939, Christ Church gave him a postgraduate grant, which the outbreak of the Second World War prevented him from taking up. After the war ended, his career followed a more predictable kind of trajectory. There were lectureships in French and later chairs at various institutions between 1946 and 1962. What could not have been predicted was that in the 10 years it took him to write The Pursuit of the Millennium, he had made himself into a historian. The Second World War was a catalyst. He volunteered for the army in 1940 and was commissioned in the Queen's Royal Regiment. His expertise in German led to his transfer into the Intelligence Corps in 1942. In 1945, from Bletchley, he and a fellow recruit were offered alternative postings in Poland or Austria. Cohen didn't get his first choice of Poland, but his consignment to Austria would have profound consequences for his future career. There he would have unlimited access to Nazi writings and would listen to Nazi officers talking to each other when they thought their captors didn't understand what they were saying. It was as a professor of French that he subsequently began researching on themes seemingly related to these issues and for really a small readership. In fact, since it was published in 1957, The Pursuit of the Millennium has never been out of print. It's been translated into French, German, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Norwegian, Greek, Hebrew and Japanese. The Times Literary Supplement in 1957 listed it as one of the 100 non-fiction works which had the greatest influence on the way in which post-war Europeans perceive themselves. Cohen is placed up there alongside Camus, Sartre and Foucault. These testimonies are impressive, but even so failed to do justice to the originality of what he was trying to do when he began the 10 years of research into his topic. There was then no overarching history of millenarianism into which a prospective book could be slotted. Marjorie Reeves faced a similar obstacle when she began her millenarian researches. These two great scholars are often rightly bracketed together. There was a very high mutual regard between them. Cohen called her 1969 work, The Influence of Prophecy in the Later Middle Ages, a great book. It was published a decade after his, although her researches for it began even earlier than his. The medieval historian Sir Richard Southern, in his introduction to Reeves' Festschrift in 1980, brought out just how unusual her proposed field of study was for the doctorate in 1932. The title was Studies in the Reputation and Influence of the Abbot Joachim of Fiore, chiefly into the 15th and 16th century. I think what's striking about it is a defensive note in her own introduction. Her credo would also be Norman Cohen's and is worth quoting at length. To treat the fantastic as history may well require explanation. We're accustomed to throw the sensible and serious actions of political life against a background of contemporary thought which is equally sober. Most of the prophetic material on which these studies are based was an altogether different complexion. It's bizarre, it is fantastic, it seems in itself to be quite worthless. Yet such material forms an essential element in historical background, and one cannot fully appreciate the texture of that background without it. And she points to a moral which, and this is as early as 1932, that to understand contemporary strange abnormal creatures, Mussolini, Hitler, Lenin, Stalin, we must dig deeper into the subsoil of prophetic belief which nurtured them. A historian today of Muggletonianism, just taking a name at random, would feel unapologetic about his choice of subject, and that would be in no small part due to the pioneering work of Cohen and Reeves. If she had published a book immediately after her thesis, she later amusedly pointed out nobody would have noticed. When the book came out in 1969, to her surprise, she found herself at the cutting edge of history. How did she know? Two Oxford history dons, independently of each other, asked her to have tea with her to talk about Antichrist. One was Hugh Trevor Roper, later Lord Dacre, and the other Christopher Hill. She claimed she'd thus been rewarded by their interest for her indolence. Sir Richard Southern put it more melodramatically. By 1969, the world was ready for Joachim, but in part the world had been made ready for it by The Pursuit of the Millennium, a book which par excellence treats the fantastic as history. Nothing fails like success. Cohen's first book met with instant acclaim. If his aim had simply been to write an acceptable history of millenarianism up to the Middle Ages, he'd pulled it off. I can't help feeling that between 1957 and 1963, and others who know much better about this, that he was in a kind of limbo. What would the professor of French do next? Well, the answer really was in the concluding chapter in The Pursuit of the Millennium, where he was he's restated his uncompleted mission to recover the historical roots of 20th century persecution and genocide. But how would he achieve this? First, by stopping being Professor of French, and then the more difficult part, by being offered to direct the newly established Columbus Centre at the University of Sussex. The Sussex years between 1963 and his retirement in 1980 were productive ones. He published 2 follow-up books, his first one, Warrant for Genocide and Europe's Inner Demons, elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 1978. But to talk about the Sussex years my personal instance, is a false gloss, because he wasn't there for most of the time at Sussex. He was very busy in research, and publications came out under the Columbus Centre aegis. But nevertheless, I realised the confusion when Sussex had a new professor of intellectual history, Rob Iliff. This was after I'd retired. I've got no credit in this, but I think it was a wonderful appointment, because he was speaking on Isaac Newton's radical heresy in the digital age. I'd never met Iliff until I heard the lecture, and to my great surprise and delight, he opened it with a tribute to the influence on his researches of the writings of Norman Cohn. And J.F.C. Harrison and myself, who had been had a joint seminar at Sussex on the Second Coming, where we came in on the coattails of this gracious tribute to Norman Cohn. The Second Coming, on our way once to teach it, John Harrison and I were accosted by an agitated university chaplain who asked us, his clerical collar bobbing, "When does the Second Coming start?" And we replied, "You tell us." But neither of us had neither John Harrison nor I had met Cohn on campus. And that's why I think, to talk about the Sussex years, I would love to claim Sussex's credit, but I mean, it was a base, but as Asa made clear, I mean, it wasn't a teaching assignment, though he gave very good lectures. And I had an undergraduate in maths who just said, "Oh, he's wonderful in the Millennium." Curiously, the undergraduates getting occasional lectures, which wasn't part of his remit. He did it because he liked talking to students. But, as I say, there was this kind of lacuna. When I started researching for this, I drew my first blank at the university library, because here, if anywhere, the archive would yield up the secrets of the setting up of the Columbus Trust. For safety reasons, it previously transferred many of its holdings to a house in Lewes, which became one of the first casualties of the great Lewes flood of 2000. My research had not dried up, it had washed away. Help was at hand, as was being made clear, by Asa, and he cleared up a lot of my puzzles. And first of all, it was a discovery to me that Sussex had never appointed Cohn and never paid him. He appointed Sussex in a curious way, because the genesis of the Columbus Centre was a meeting in April 1962 to commemorate the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. The editor and proprietor of The Observer, David Astor, gave an address which was printed in Encounter in the following August. He argued that we are still far from grasping the full implications of the Holocaust and called for an academic study of the processes which led up to it. Future study would be most fruitful, he believed, if comparisons were made with other exterminating movements. Astor's address provoked much interest between 1962 and 1963, and which led to discussions to which the author of The Pursuit of the Millennium was asked to contribute. In 1963, Astor offered Cohn the post of director of the centre, still to be set up, for research into collective psychopathologies, its initial title. The Trust met annually, earliest days chaired by R.A. Butler. One question, it was clear that Norman Cohn himself saw that his central concern was quote, the urge to purify the world through the annihilating of some category of human beings imagined as agents of corruption and incarnation of evil. In other words, his books stayed firmly within the remit of the Columbus Centre and the David Astor remit, if you like. And if this was a burden to Cohen, at least we now know it was a self-imposed one, the product of all the intensive conversations which preceded the setting up of the centre. A question remains, did the teleology get in the way of the history? I believe firmly it didn't, but in one minor nitpicking way, in my own interests, I felt that it led him to overrate the ranters in the story of the English Revolution. He actually introduces them in an almost apologetic note that he put in an appendix, a sect which he called Curious in 1957, and in any way belonging to a later period. But by 1970, the third edition, he speaks about the almost wholly forgotten ranters as a link in a chain from 13th century to the present day. And that was a point also made by A.L. Morton in the first monograph on the ranters, also in 1970, and Norman wrote an essay, An Encounter, on the ranters there. He went so far with his enthusiasm to say that his 17th century appendix gave him a confidence in his medieval sources which might otherwise have been rash. But the interests, anyway, of Norman Cohn have often been misrepresented. I believe that it was a kind of accident of timing. In 1957, when the first book was published, Ingmar Bergman's great film, The Seventh Seal, was just released. And I almost got the feeling that the medieval flagellants had just stepped straight out of the film set and onto Cohen's pages. And once encountered there, they stayed in the reader's mind and were meant to. Generations of undergraduates have thrilled to Norman's masterly evocation of the messianic reign of John of Leyden. But Cohen was always aware of millenarian beliefs having stabilising as well as destabilising effects. And in a way, the whole liveness in Norman Cohen's book is the Reformation in Tudor and Stuart England, with its state-sponsored cult of the godly emperor. Cohen was given an opportunity to develop more nuanced views of Joachim at a remarkable symposium held at St John's College, Oxford, the only time I met Norman. And this has been for scholars invited to contribute to a proposed Festschrift from Marjorie Reeves. And Cohen was one of three who didn't, in the end, contribute papers, and so he's absent from the 1870 and the 1980 volume that came out. Marjorie Reeves herself made a separate inquiry 2 years after the symposium into the absorption of Joachim, if indeed there was any, into 17th century Puritan thought. She found none of the writers she consulted showing direct use of medieval sources, with the possible exception of William Dell, and yet her findings, although scrupulously cautious, are not in the end negative. She claims that in relating history and prophecy, the Protestant thinkers still follow a medieval way of thought. 7 years later, in his introduction to her Festschrift, Sir Richard Southern saw that what was original in her treatment of Joachim was her understanding of his importance in the prophetic pattern of history. In a brilliantly prescient aside, he claimed that pattern to be, quote, still fully alive in Isaac Newton in 1700. We've come round full circle to Professor Iliff's Sussex lecture. Now, I've had the benefit of reading, thanks to the British Academy, Norman's own comments about himself, which are modest and very illuminating. And I've also been helped by a former Sussex colleague who's the trustee for Lord Dacre, Blair Worden, and I was reading the correspondence between Norman and Trevor Roper, which is interesting, because Trevor Roper was one of the earliest admirers of Norman, but they didn't quite agree about psychoanalysis. He hinted at one letter, when Norman said something, Dacre hinted at a possible area of disagreement and said, I really must assure you I'm not proposing to write or sponsor a retrospective psychoanalysis of Hitler. This rumour was started by a press agency which passed it on to the Times and the Guardian. Now, psychoanalysis, and I know it's coming up later in the series, was given great weight in the early discussions about the setting up of the Columbus Trust, and Anthony Storr was very persuasive. And Cohen reiterated to Dacre his belief in its validity. But the review of The Warrant for Genocide, which was full of praise of a fascinating and exciting book, but he criticised Norman for crediting ideas with great, almost autonomous continuity. And he saw the anti-Semitism of both books, this was his perception, as having a great, almost autonomous continuity. These criticisms and praise recur in the review of Dacre's review of Cohen's last book in his trilogy, Europe's Inner Demons. Again, he revels in Cohen's detective work in exposing the 19th century precursors of Margaret Murray, who come from the same world, fanatical Catholics, sniffing conspiracy and Freemasonry everywhere. What he misses in this interesting book is background, the worldview of the late Middle Ages, and method, the Inquisitor's use of torture. And then a characteristic Trevor Roper barb, these, I believe, are more relevant than the psychohistorical speculations about the repressed cannibalistic impulses of infancy ascribed to the psychoanalysts of the Kleinian school, to which Mr. Cohen devotes somewhat a speculative postscript. Actually, Dacre himself, in his own later essay on the European witch craze, seeks to recognise the relativism of Lucien Febvre, the great Annales scholar, and yet combine it with, and recognising the contingent nature of rationalism itself, and yet at the same time this dismissive reduction of witchcraft belief to mental and social pathologies. Protestant eschatology in Tudor and Stuart England at least is now seen by many of us as much an orthodox and reinforcing agent as it was a vehicle for radical dissent. Millenarian and witchcraft beliefs are seen to complement as much as challenge the general assumptions of their age. As one historian put it, to share them was not an indication of personal or social alienation and maladjustment, but of deep involvement in a collective mentality. Norman did not bridle at this revisionism, he welcomed it. It is a measure of his humility and capacity for self-criticism that in his later years he should quietly set about expunging from later editions of his works passages which no longer now seem to him right. Remarkable kind of humility here, and the disappearance of many of them reflected the fact, as he put it in his private papers, quote, I no longer regard the psychoanalytical approach to social phenomena as fruitful. But the Cohen, to conclude, the Cohen-Reeves tradition of treating history, fantasy as history, is in the good hands of a younger generation of scholars, and I've been particularly impressed by Stuart Clark's excellent 1997 book, Thinking with Demons. The very Cohen-like title of his work reveals his concern to treat demonologists, and keep them wrapped up in inverted commas, not as obsessionals, but as men who turn to the subject to make sense of their other concerns as theologians, priests and philosophers. Cohen would have said amen to that. Stuart Clark paid, I believe, the best of all tributes to Norman Cohen when he called the pamphleteer John Wagstaff a 17th century Norman Cohen. For Wagstaff, the concept of witches originated in priest denunciation of private rivals and developed when priests of different religions called one another so and condemned one another's religions. Jews called Christians witches, Christians called heathens witches, inquisitors and Jesuits called heretics and reformers witches. Confessions of witchcraft were then dictated to the accused by their torturing inquisitors. Clark was right, I think, in his characterisation. Wagstaff, writing in 1671, could just as easily have been Norman Cohen, more than 200 years later, putting Margaret Murray to write about covens, or Tsarist forgers to write about Jewish world conspiracies. Cohen spent a lifetime on Thinking with Demons, and we have been immeasurably the richer for it.
Thank you.
Medievalists might have rejoiced twice over in 1957 when two half-breakers appeared, like London buses, at once. You would be wrong. In fact, double celebration was, in fact, an impossibility. For the two books on related subjects entered a world divided by an iron curtain. The first was Norman Cohn's The Pursuit of the Millennium, published in London, written while Cohn held the chair of French at Magee University College, Derry. The other was Bernhard Töpfer's Volk und Kirche zur Zeit der beginnenden Gottesfriedensbewegung in Frankreich, published in East Berlin in the GDR, where Töpfer taught at the Humboldt University, which remained his base until his Emeritierung in 1991. In both cases, these were the author's first books. Like Cohn, Töpfer saw wartime service, but more briefly. Born in 1926, Töpfer was 18 when the war ended. He was held prisoner in Russia and returned to Germany to enroll at university in 1947. Töpfer's subject, he said, was the relationship between the church and the lower classes of society in 10th and 11th century France. The theme had been well worked for decades in continental historiography, especially French historiography, on the year 1000. In that year, allegedly, many, even most Christians, expected the end of time. Anti-clericals had argued that the church manufactured the terrors to strengthen its grip on believers. Catholic historians had argued that the church responded to popular terror of apocalypse by offering spiritual protection through its rites and saint cults. Töpfer, though as far as I can see innocent of French debates, was nearer to the latter position, but with an unsurprising conclusion. The church's goal was unsurprising, given where he was writing, and then was to implant its ideology in the masses and to secure control over them. In Töpfer's view, then, the church was most fully and impressively embodied in monasteries. These had attracted a large historiography of their own, for it was their scriptoria that produced the saints' lives and the miracle stories which recorded relic cults and their impact. It was Benedictines who also invented the modern discipline of history, entailing the critical use of documents. Marc Bloch hailed 1681, the year of the publication of Dom Mabillon's De Re Diplomatica, How to Study Charters, as truly a great year in the history of the human mind. It did need to be followed, though, this is me, not Marc Bloch, by other much more recent great years, when, for instance, university historians critically examined the substance of charters, in which they noted, for instance, that it was exclusively the monks who, in recording land grants from the laity, wrote in the threats of divine judgment on the mean-minded and the backsliders. Anyway, Töpfer used the miracle stories, above all, as if they were scenes from rural life, to investigate how the church's ideas were received by the masses, described in these texts as flocking to shrines and demanding entry. In these stories were lively descriptions of the interaction between monasteries and folk, whence could be inferred the social conditions that affected that relationship. Folk meant the peasantry. Töpfer regarded landowners as the lay wing of feudal control and actually had rather little to say about them, probably because their historical role seemed to him obvious. Kirche, as I've said, meant the monasteries, because bishops and priests in the 10th and early 11th centuries had little to do with the lower orders. This was an age before parishes. The bishops and priests functioned simply as agents and adjuncts of feudal lords. This Marxist picture was curiously mirrored in non-Marxist historiographies. Economic and social history belonged in the non-confessional mainstream of higher education. Ecclesiastical history tended, I'm talking about the 1950s, to be a field unto itself, largely in the hands of confessionally linked writers and religious institutions, though sometimes co-opted into particular brands of national stories, as in the case of Charlemagne. another emperor with a mission. Ecclesiastical history was emphatically not about the laity, let alone the folk. Thus, the changes that scholars of very different persuasions could agree occurred from around the year 1000 through certain transformations into the 11th and 12th centuries had been mostly put in separate boxes and studied apart. The origins of religious change were sought in religious phenomena, social and economic changes were attributed to social and economic ones. Scholars even displayed a certain fastidiousness in straddling scholarly fields labelled so clearly other. Yawning between the historiographies of religious experience and political and social activity was a huge disconnect. Turpfer saw monastic leaders as consciously seeking, even inventing, themes and modes of mass communication, he said, to be reasonably compared with modern propaganda, that resonated with the lower classes in order to bind them more closely to monastic cults. Portrayed in monastic texts were some new triangulations of interest. Collaboration between lay and clerical feudal elites was subordinated to the monastery's quest for political influence and social power, which set them in competition with feudal lords. Protection of the poor against the violence inherent in feudal lordship assumed precedence over elite solidarity between feudal lords and feudal church. And as an epiphenomenon, the poor were assigned a more insistent role in claiming access to the holy. So the main story emanating from East Berlin in 1957 was about monks repositioning their institutions and themselves and finding new ways to strengthen their control of the rural population. Cohen's story from London, or Derry, had a different focus and chronology and a much longer view. His interest was in the 11th and 12th centuries and the sociological and psychological effects of the urbanisation attested in contemporary urban sources. Cohn dared to connect. To him, it seemed a fair inference that the immigrants drawn from villages to towns because of new work opportunities felt themselves to be isolated individuals, deracinated from kin and community and from whatever religious anchorages rural cults had provided. The mushroom towns of the Low Countries and their precocious weaving industries became Norman Cohn's laboratories for the study of unprecedented social behaviours in new, weakly structured environments, shorn of customary protections and sadly lacking in ecclesiastical props in both senses. Cohen's prime case study was recorded in a letter by urban canons. Letters are always important to medievalists, probably other historians too, because they are contemporary, instantaneous, as it were, reactions to their own circumstances. These urban canons were obviously not monks, they were secular clergy, and they relied on local informants. The letter had been published in the age of Mabillon, and it had been noticed by modern historians, economic historians, but never approached before from Cohn's angle. The case occurred in Antwerp, when a former count's notary named Tankhelm gravitated there from Bruges circa 1110. Antwerp had a large immigrant population, but only one priest. And that one priest had a concubine. Such a priest was the prime target of Orthodox reformers. He couldn't offer even the everyday services the church promised, let alone salvation. Norman Cohn diagnosed disorientated immigrants as susceptible to the pull of prophecy, of prophetic suggestions of new hope and a new sense of community. Here was formed a new people, a chosen people, a populace, or perhaps a commoner term in 11th and 12th century writers, a vulgus, a crowd. Its centre was a charismatic preacher or prophet with what Cohn termed a court of devotees. Unlike earlier crowds of pilgrims rallying at a particular moment to witness for that moment the discoveries or relocations of the holy bodies of the long dead, this new vulgus assumed an identity and eschatological validity embodied in a leader very much alive. The vulgus around Tankhelm, which Cohn made the earliest of medieval Europe's messianic movements, had traits often replicated thereafter, but the most important of them were the crowd itself, formed by the chosen ones bent on salvation, and a living leader claiming to be and acknowledged as a holy man. The line between orthodox reformism and heresy was crossed when the prophet identified the enemy as none other than the corrupt clergy, infiltrated by minions of the devil and hell-bent. The contemporary denunciations of Tankhelm came from the pens of clergy, secular clergy, under threat. Some of what was new in Cohn's analysis owed a lot to the sociology and psychology of groups. In 1957, these were fairly new branches of the social sciences. His analysis made space for collective passion, not to be dismissed as random or irrational, but revealed as rooted in themes and symbols drawn from Scripture and recurrently rediscovered in Christian history. And within that repertoire, expressive of town dwellers' reasoned responses, and I'm putting in the word reason because I think they were reasoned given the circumstances of these town dwellers. Their responses were to religious insecurity, to neglect, to angst. The concatenation of enthusiasm among the followers of Tankhelm, or on a much bigger scale among the poor of the First Crusade, or a little later the classless heretic crowds of the 12th and 13th century, was dynamic, explosive, purposeful, often violent, potentially revolutionary. This was how Cohn depicted these crowds. And these crowds or sects found new meaning and an identity, and its emotional energy was concentrated, in part because the crowd was directed by charismatic leaders, qualified for this role by rigorous asceticism. These men, and they were almost always men, were regarded as holy. Their gender, as well as their holiness, mattered. Among Cohn's, to my mind, perceptive remarks on the Cathars, dualist heretics, were his pinpointing of the motivations of the great ladies of southern France who patronised and protected the religious virtuosi. These women, I quote, were clearly moved by emotional conflicts such as nowadays would have led them to theosophy or maybe to psychoanalysis. Let that observation reverberate in your historians' minds before you impose a stiff mutatis mutandis. Perhaps it takes someone trained as a scholar of medieval languages and literature to be bolder in interpreting than a historian. The impact of Cohn's book was immediate, not necessarily confined to the niche market of universities. By the 1960s and the 1970s, when studies of marginal people, gays, women, heretics, dissenters began to proliferate, Cohn was inspiring a new generation of authors and readers with a new approach to medieval religion, which united the bottom up with the top down, and was, for that very reason, much more concerned with the bottom up, because it had been neglected hitherto. Among those thus inspired by Norman Cohn were Geoffrey B. Russell and Edward Peters in North America, and in the UK, R.I. Moore, who in a paper read to the Royal Historical Society in 1979 hailed the appearance of the crowd on the stage of public events. I, as an undergraduate in 1961, was an early beneficiary of the pursuit of the Millennium, for reading lists soon registered change by including the book, even if some of our lecturers' pages, when turned, still puffed out the dust of ages. Medieval religion, no longer anchored in ecclesiastical institutions and expositions of orthodox doctrine, and its antonym, heresy. It wasn't at a theoretical level, this. but peopled by flesh and blood, active and vocal laymen and women, acquired new traction, and students were duly attracted to new courses with titles like Heresy and Dissent, Official and Unofficial Religion. In time, Berlin and London, or Brighton, came within hailing distance of each other. In the decades after 1980, the notion of a medieval Christian society has come to seem much more complicated and problematic. If the terrors of the year 1000 have been dissipated, the dark side of medieval Europe's golden centuries, the 12th and 13th centuries, has emerged more starkly and disturbingly. And historians, like my colleague John Arnold, have exposed psychic history in lay visions and lay confessions to inquisitors. Such historians have often cited, very often cited, The Pursuit of the Millennium as a starting point. Equally, that book, like Europe's Inner Demons, has been less cited or quoted by other historians than listed in bibliographies, as by Richard Landis and Dominique Barthélemy, or latterly Bob Moore or Alexander Murray. Well, that is immortality of another kind. Books that, having challenged and been responded to, their conclusions qualified and refined not least by the author himself, have settled into the foundational nurturing sediment of variegated medieval disciplines. And meanwhile, Norman Cohn had already changed the face of medieval European history for good.
This kind invitation to speak at this conference celebrating the life and work of Norman Cohn. In addition to the topic on which I will very shortly speak, Robert asked me to say a few words about the use of Pursuit of the Millennium in the classroom today. I found it difficult, however, to integrate this line of thought into my argument, so I decided to say two things here as a brief preface. In Montreal, I teach graduate courses in ancient apocalypticism, medieval apocalypticism, and modern apocalypticism. The only book that is common to all three courses is Norman Cohn's Pursuit of the Millennium. My second point, and in light of the recent comment about bibliographies, is that I am currently preparing, entirely by coincidence, the entry on medieval apocalypticism for the Oxford Bibliographies Online, which is designed particularly for students. Pursuit of the Millennium was the very first book I included, with the notation that it is, quote, the most important book published on the study of apocalypticism. The book, however, is not without its flaws or its detractors. It is well known that the book's conception of late medieval millenarianism in the West as a radical revolutionary social phenomenon remains the object of some criticism among scholars of medieval apocalypticism. One objection, which is not without merit, is that apocalyptic traditions could and did extend to arenas that were intended, as Bernard McGinn put it, to support the institutions of medieval Christianity. Another objection, perhaps most associated with Richard Landis, is that millenarianism admits a savior-oriented top-down variety in addition to the demotic bottom-up variety that typifies the examples adduced by Cohn in Pursuit. These criticisms are not solely intramural, nor are they unrelated. For if it could be demonstrated that the millennial flame was sparked by social settings or historical situations that were independent of the urge for radical social change, or which envisioned a salvation that was otherworldly or personal, this would potentially change our understanding of the worldview and therein cast doubt on the propriety of locating the roots of modern secular apocalypticism in medieval religious millenarianism. To use a zoological analogy, if we are convinced that birds fly, we run the risk of labeling bats as birds and penguins is something else. Yet, despite this and other criticisms, it is fair to say, more than a half-century after the appearance of its first edition, that The Pursuit of the Millennium is, to re-quote, the most influential book ever published on the study of apocalypticism. Professor Nelson has already shed light on Cohn's contribution to medieval history, and in the next session, I understand Professor Gray will delve into the subject of apocalyptic politics. My contribution will focus on the influence of The Pursuit of the Millennium on the study of apocalypticism as a global and historical worldview, an influence that remains ongoing today. In my view, the passage which encapsulates the enduring influence of Pursuit on the study of apocalypticism is the programmatic statement that opens its third chapter. Considering the many millenarian movements that arose across Northern Europe from the 12th to the 16th centuries, Cohn writes, quote, however hazardous it may be to pursue the causation of social phenomena in a society which cannot itself be directly observed, the incidence of revolutionary millenarianism is here far too clearly defined, both in time and in space, to be without significance. A bird's-eye view suggests that social situations in which outbreaks of revolutionary millenarianism occurred were in fact remarkably uniform, and this impression is confirmed when one comes to examine particular outbreaks in detail. The areas in which the age-old prophecies about the last days took on a new revolutionary meaning and a new explosive force were the areas which were becoming seriously overpopulated and were involved in a process of rapid economic and social change, unquote. Even now, 50 years on, the assumptions behind this bold declaration of principles remain fresh. It does not matter that revolutionary millenarianism can no longer be equated with apocalypticism, or that early Jewish apocalypticism is hardly the direct descendant of biblical prophecy, as scholarship once thought. What does matter is that Norman Cohn was able to recognize, in the mass of seemingly unconnected data, the pattern of a coherent, comprehensive, and internally consistent worldview. And not only are Cohn's assumptions still fresh, they remain relevant. At an intensive workshop last month in Milan, which sought to re-examine the origins and nature of ancient apocalypticism, a consensus seemed to be developing towards the concept of multiple apocalypticisms. I do not share this view. And it so happened that I had brought along my copy of Pursuit, and I read aloud the passage I just quoted in support of a single worldview. In so doing, I was arguing, as Cohn himself had argued, that the proper point of entry for the study of the various phenomena is the worldview. This point is not at the level of the microscopic, whether this is identified with the individual early Jewish apocalypses or the separate millenarian movements. Nor, for that matter, is the point of entry at the level of the macroscopic, where an apocalypticism is envisioned either as a part of a fuzzy cloud of ancient mantic literature or as part of an aggregate of medieval speculative traditions that include dream interpretation, astrologic forecasting, and Hechelot mysticism. What is most striking about the Milan episode, however, is not that the group divested itself of the awkward notion of multiple apocalyptic worldviews, but that I was later approached by 3 scholars who expressed that they had been thinking along precisely the same lines and had derived their inspiration from reading Pursuit of the Millennium. Indeed, one scholar added that this passage was so important to his research, he had long since memorized it. Nothing could have underscored the ongoing relevance of Pursuit more clearly. Another revolutionary assumption encapsulated in the aforesaid passage and manifested throughout the book is Cohn's methodology that approached apocalypticism primarily as a social phenomenon. To understand this properly, we must recall that, until the 1960s at least, the scientific investigation of apocalypticism was very much dominated by theologians and biblical scholars. As such, it was primarily a textual critical endeavor, which, until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the rediscovery of the extra-biblical apocalyptic literature of early Judaism, focused on the book of Daniel, the portrait of Jesus in the canonical Gospels, and above all, the revelation of John. In some circles, most notably among New Testament scholars, things have hardly changed. But Cohn saw things differently, and these differences still matter. In many ways, he is the godfather of the social scientific study of modern new religious movements, which tend towards the type of eschatological beliefs that are common to the groups that were the subject of his inquiry. Instead of attempting to trace the textual history of a medieval apocalypse, or advancing identifications of the historical events and figures to which its bizarre images might refer, Cohn and his intellectual descendants inquire as to who joins these radical groups, and for what purposes, and most importantly, under what social conditions. For as much as Cohn's knowledge of the languages accorded him a familiarity with the literature that most scholars can only dream of, for him, at least insofar as I am able to know the man through his books, the texts and their theologies were never the goal of his research. Rather, they were a starting point, by means of which he could say something about the people who wrote them and the conditions under which they did so. What a revolutionary idea. Cohn also recognized that despite the basic historical continuity, apocalypticism, and more specifically millenarianism, is a profoundly adaptable worldview. I am not referring to what Frank Kermode observed as the ability of apocalyptic prophecies to be, quote, disconfirmed without being discredited, unquote, although Cohn himself certainly noted this characteristic in Pursuit. Rather, Cohn brought into high relief the worldview's fundamental dynamism. On the one hand, this dynamism allowed revolutionary millennialism to root itself in an exceptionally wide variety of cultural ecologies and historical situations. In this fashion, Cohn could draw a line between the Crusades and the Anabaptists, and between the itinerant messiahs of the early Middle Ages and figures such as Thomas Münzer. On the other hand, and to return the focus to the ongoing relevance of Pursuit on the study of apocalypticism, Cohn comprehended that the worldview itself was dynamic, and that the theological scaffolding that supported medieval millenarianism involved far more than an endless series of reboots of the old biblical texts in light of new historical circumstances. Thus, we encounter in Pursuit the first comprehensive examination of medieval apocalypticism that, while based on the book of Daniel and the revelation of John, also circumscribes the post-biblical apocalyptic texts, from the Sibylla Tiburtina and the revelations of Pseudo-Methodius, which Cohn lumps together under the rubric of Sibylline traditions, to Joachim Fiore, and the many hundreds of late medieval apocalyptic oracles, prophecies, tracts, and other texts from which he wove the fabric of his book. Similarly, Cohn highlighted not only how the ancient images of the four kingdoms of Daniel and the Whore of Babylon of Revelation were reconstituted in their new late medieval Sitzim Leben, but also how new images, such as the figures of the last Roman emperor and the Antichrist, took their place in the myth kitty from which the late medieval apocalypticists drew. At the same time, Pursuit of the Millennium proposed a mechanism by which the intellectual substance of these texts and images were reified in concrete historical situations. This mechanism, in turn, rested on several propositions, among which was the presumption of a grave and extensive social disruption and the resultant necessity of a large mass of marginalized and frequently dispossessed persons for whom the millennial dream of heaven on earth was a response to this disruption. This is wrong, of course. The evidence from the ancient world demonstrates that apocalypticism frequently appeared in the context of relatively small groups and in social settings whose social disruption was similarly limited. Yet the study of ancient apocalypticism, in its turn, had focused too much on these small groups, and most significantly on the role of oppression, persecution, and the menace of death at the hands of a foreign imperial overlord. Recall the apocalyptic revelations of the book of Daniel, which were composed during the persecutions of the Hellenistic monarch Antiochus, or the revelation of John, which, if not a reaction to the persecutions of the Emperor Domitian, was patently composed in light of Rome as the final kingdom. One could also point to the Jewish revolts against Rome, first in the years 66 to 73 CE, and then again under Hadrian's reign, and after that the Bar Kokhba revolt. Thus, in its stress on millennialism as a response to internal changes, but without sidetracking the key role of the evil empire in apocalyptic speculation, Pursuit of the Millennium provided a much-needed corrective to this one-sided view that apocalypticism was mainly the product of external oppression. It put an end to the so-called crisis theory as a global expansion for the cause of eschatological speculation. I have charted a few ways in which Pursuit of the Millennium has affected the scientific study of millennial speculation and apocalyptic thought, in its groundbreaking taxonomy that regards apocalypticism as a coherent worldview and as the proper starting point for the investigation of the phenomenon. In the understanding that apocalypticism is principally a social phenomenon and must be examined with social questions in mind, and in deeper notions relating to the organic dynamism of the worldview itself. Deeper still, essentially underwriting all these elements, there is a well-developed sense of the epistemology of apocalypticism, which works from the combination of several propositions and includes corollaries and claims that may be logically derived from them. Let me expand on this a bit. Many of the elements that are popularly associated with apocalypticism are not apocalyptic in themselves. One might think that the expectation for the end of the world, for example, is quintessentially apocalyptic, but this is not the case. The same is true for messianic figures and the notion of eschatology and the anticipation of life after death. Likewise, much has been written about the central relevance of pseudepigraphy and of the importance of the literary genre apocalypse. It is impossible to discuss ancient apocalypticism without reference to either figure. But neither is a central hallmark of the worldview outside its ancient manifestations, as evidenced in the very minor roles that both play in Pursuit. The question, or questions really, what is apocalypticism? Why has it proven so historically persistent? Might seem rather simplistic. But I think a moment's reflection will cause one to recognize that by means of an investigation whose scope was well defined in both chronology and geography, are the very questions Norman Cohn attempted to answer in Pursuit. And Cohn realized that they are fundamentally epistemological in nature. This, I contend, is where Pursuit of the Millennium makes its greatest and most enduring contribution, both to the study of apocalypticism and also to Western civilization. It is not enough merely to identify the expectations and motifs and other features that appear and reappear time and again among the literary and non-literary expressions of the worldview. Expectations, motifs, and features acquire apocalyptic valence only by virtue of the worldview, through its propositions and claims, which acts as a lens, if you will, by which one's life and community are viewed. Apocalypticism, as Cohn realized, is a distinctive understanding of the world, one that freights notions about time, space, and human existence. One of these notions is apocalyptic otherness, which both Pursuit and Cohn's later books are intimately concerned, and which relies on a firm grasp of apocalyptic epistemology. Apocalyptic otherness works from the interaction of two epistemological poles, the rational and the emotive. Reading through Pursuit, one can observe how carefully Cohn delineates the two poles. On the one hand, he demonstrates how apocalypticism works from a rational, well-formed historiography, or the way that history is conceived, contrary to what might be expected from a worldview that so often envisions a catastrophic end. The God of apocalypticism is a God of order, not chaos. His is the hand that moves history along its rather regular and predestined path. This same sense of order underpins the view that human history is constitutionally structured by a pervasive dualism that is articulated on all planes of existence. The microscopic, for instance, the good and evil inclination in the heart. The macroscopic, angels and demons. And, as it applies to the subject at hand, the mundane. In the apocalyptic mindset, there are two kinds of everything: persons, nations, and people. There is no room within the logic of the worldview for anything resident between the two absolutes of good and evil, which are opposite and irreducible. The emotive pole, on the other hand, relies on the worldview's logic for its reference points, but is subject to elements beyond intellection. Cohn saw that apocalyptic ideology served as a vehicle for expressions of desires and emotions among certain elements of the population that were a reaction to the social situations. These desires are not automatically base. One may see them in a noble light. We long, for example, to validate those whom this world tramples. We desire an antidote to despair an enemy, and hunger to console and exhort those who must endure oppression and the menace of death. We pursue the hope of sanctuary and the dream of utopia. Cohn detected these desires both in the millennial groups of the late Middle Ages and in the tendency, as he wrote in the conclusion to the third edition of Pursuit, of the working classes of the modern era to improve their lot. Yet Cohn was well aware of how the baser emotions most often trumped the noble ones. Pursuit is full of episodes of torture, rape, and wholesale destruction, given an ideological framework and an eschatological horizon by the apocalyptic worldview, and powered by the conviction of apocalyptic otherness. The belief that a hidden reality governs existence can nurture feelings of paranoia and xenophobia, particularly when one's lifestyle is threatened. This plays to the fact that persons tend to be most at ease with their own lifestyles and beliefs, even if these are in constant flux or even incompatible. Alternately, persons are less likely to understand, accept, or even tolerate lifestyles or beliefs other than their own. That this is true for nearly every person is not a point of dispute. Apocalypticism, though, amplifies every distinction and brings it into high relief. This is partly due to the internal logic of the worldview, and partly to a feedback loop that results from a dearth of external data and social stimuli. The latter phenomenon, known as social encapsulation, develops spontaneously or is cultivated by charismatic leaders, which are a regular feature in Pursuit. In this setting, I contend, it induces a condition that may be described as apocalyptic narcosis. Fear and terror beget hatred and revenge. Apocalypticism gives full rein to revenge fantasies, facilitated by a historiography that justifies the reasons and guarantees the results. Violence, as Cohn realized, is an inbuilt feature of the system. Neither benevolent coexistence nor tolerant accommodation is an outcome. What cannot be assimilated must be smashed. It is either conversion or annihilation, the little death or the great death, and nothing in between. I have not read all of Norman Cohn's opera, and certainly cannot speak to the influence of his other books besides Cosmos and Chaos. But it seems to me that Cohn was intensely concerned with the concept of the demonization of enemies, and the uses to which this demonization was put throughout history. What Cohn accomplished in Pursuit of the Millennium was to identify, precisely and on epistemological grounds, the link between ideology and sociology, and between worldview and expression. And if it is true that certain social ecologies are more conducive to the growth and fructification of apocalypticism, and other social ecologies are toxic to it, as I believe is true, then it behooves us to seek to understand this age of apocalypse in which we presently live. And I can think of no better guide to this than Norman Cohn. Thank you.
Time for thoughts, discussions, further contributions. I sort of have medievalist thoughts I might share in a moment if nobody else pitches in, but I invite colleagues to share thoughts first. Thank you. Well, to get us rolling, yes, thank you very much, William. Perhaps I could ask something to all three speakers. I was thinking about, as I came down on the train this morning, I was looking through both Pursuit and Europe's Inner Demons, and thinking about some of the aspects which Cohn identifies through his different linkages. And the one which I think has always fascinated me most, and where perhaps I think I want to slightly ease myself away from what I think he sees, is what he calls anarcho-communism in the pre-modern thought, and linked to that apocalyptic transformation which you talked about. And where I want to slightly ease myself away from what I think where I think usually his sense of anarcho-communism is essentially fairly condemnatory. That is, I think there's association for him of mid-20th century communism as well. And the bit that has, when I've thought about these areas, I've wanted to think about the fact that actually for a lot of the people he's discussing, quite a lot of things were already held in common, and that calls for all to be in common were in a sense an extension of an existing social practice rather than an absolute complete transformatory revelation. But I don't know, but that's only for the bits I know about. So I wonder if I could ask all three if that speaks to any of the things that you're interested in, that sense of whether the thinking of things in common, how that links into the notion of both marginalised groups and apocalyptic thought in general. But I don't want to set you too difficult a homework question. If there's so feel free to respond to something.
No? Oh, well.
Go ahead.
Okay, fine. I think the first thing to realise is that apocalypticism as a worldview, if it indeed is a worldview, as I believe it is, and I think probably that view is shared by many around this table, the degree to which may be under some dispute, is this, that it does admit marginal groups. There's no other question. But it equally admits groups in power. Yes? Right. I think this is fundamental. And I think we see examples of it, if not so much in the ancient world, where it was limited to early Judaism and early Christianity for the most part. Although Cohn makes a case, and I'm sure we'll get to this in the fourth session, that certain elements arose out of Zoroastrianism. But even that, we must remember that Zoroastrian was the official religion of the Persian Empire, and it certainly wasn't marginalized. Yes.
Yeah.
So, I can stop there.
Yeah. Willie, with your early modern folk, does that notion? How do you see that notion of things being held in common operating in an early modern English context?
Well, as I say, the thing that I kind of reacted against in quite an early book, Godly Rule, was what was coming over to me was the way in which the Millennium was being used to make authority stronger in so many areas, and yet the sort of stereotype that people had was, as I say, derived from Ingmar Bergman.
Yes.
Like that. The focus on the and I became interested in studying Richard Baxter in the 17th century, who was not thought of as being moved by these sort of things, but in fact I had to read a whole lot of his papers to see how actually he found pushed more and more in the study of the apocalypse to venerate the role of the Christian emperor in all this, and of course that's in Norman Cohn's book itself. I mean, the so many entries are about in the index, for instance, and yet it's almost frozen in the kind of popular mind as being all about revolt.
Yes.
Well, it's hard to add anything to that except just to pursue what I think is behind John's question, which is the point that holding in common is absolutely fundamental to Christianity, to Orthodox Christianity. The Acts of the Apostles being cited endlessly, that little pair of verses which talk about the apostles in Jerusalem having all things common. It's the basis of the apostolic life which inspires monastic movements and also lay movements, particularly in the later Middle Ages, but I would say right through the medieval period, that you've got different practices, different realizations of this apostolic ideal, which do in fact involve sharing. You share. You can be a donor to the monks, and then you go and visit the monks, and they give you a feast and so on. You can do that if you're a humble person or a rich person. And when you get to the 13th century with the Franciscans, then you haven't even got huge class divides initially. You've got really quite a sort of sharing of meanings between the people who join the Franciscans and the people who give to them. They depend on begging to subsist at all. So I think that that you've got this millenarian theme being very much part of this world until the end comes. You don't know when it's going to be. Maybe the apostolic community in Jerusalem believed that it would be the day after tomorrow, and it's clear that some of them did. But by the Middle Ages, I would say that most of the time, most people did not believe it was going to be the day after tomorrow, and that the church authorities, not only to preserve their own power, were very much opposed to speculating about when the end would come. They said it was biblically forbidden to speculate in that way. And as for the way in which millennial ideology can strengthen authority, yes, it can, but there again, there's a kind of porousness about it that it's going to spread out to people that rulers want to, whose force rulers want to contain, but also want to get on board. And I think the more one thing that Norman Cohn couldn't have done, because he worked on the period he worked on, but I would say that far more signs of millennial belief and influence on people in power, but also poor people, right through the Middle Ages, from the period that I specialise in, which is the earlier Middle Ages, to the later, which John works on, and probably including a lot of the things that the other speakers have mentioned in the early modern period, late Middle Ages and early modern periods as well. So I think we that what I admire about Norman Cohn is that he's always sort of pushing at boundaries, but that his mind was capacious. He could contain within it simultaneously things that to lesser folk like you and me might seem contradictory.
May I add a point?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, just two points came to mind on the subject that was raised. The first is, I mean, when one thinks of communism, communal beliefs, and so on, sharing, in context of apocalyptic beliefs, one naturally thinks of the earliest Christianity. The problem there, though, of course, we're not exactly sure what constituted the earliest Christianity because we don't know the period in which the documents actually reflect. But having said that, we do have a remarkable corpus of a group that practiced a very similar type of communism or communal living and was intensely apocalyptic, and this is the community of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there's no question that these documents reflect a vibrant community that existed on and off for 250-odd years. So there's a prime example. The second point I'd like to make is, and this is something of a bit of a pitfall for those who study millenarianism, especially in its medieval varieties, is that it's quite often restricted to millennialism in the West. And when we expand our horizons and include Eastern Byzantine apocalyptic eschatologies, and also Jewish and Christian, which derived from the Christian, Jewish and Islamic, which derived from the Christian early medieval speculation, we find that in contrast to this top-down, don't speculate, don't worry, it's not going to come tomorrow, we find hundreds, if not thousands, of texts that absolutely fit Norman Cohn's model of an imminent apocalypse looking forward. Now, some of it isn't always from marginalized communities. Quite often, you see a Daniel apocalypse or a Pseudo-Methodian apocalypse being written time and again in response to the next Arab army or navy that was appeared outside the walls of Constantinople, right? But I think it's some, just as the danger, and I was trying to get at this in my paper a bit, just as there's the danger of interpreting apocalypticism through the lens of the New Testament, and particularly the Revelation of John, there's somewhat of a danger of interpreting medieval apocalypticism through Western medieval sources. And I don't think that's exactly right. I think we've got to expand the horizon a bit more if we're going to understand apocalypticism as a worldview. I feel very strongly about that.
Daniel.
Thank you. I was very interested. I'm just going back to what Jinty was just saying about Norman Cohn's capacious approach and pushing at boundaries. I just wanted to come back, actually, Jinty, to what you said about the rationality issue when you were talking about his debt to the psychology of groups, and that these passions should not be seen as irrational, perhaps, but as rooted, you said, expressive of reasoned responses given the circumstances of the subjects in question. And that seems to be, in a way, that side of him that would be a critique of the psychopathological model of the social. So it's kind of wanting to do away with the idea of madness and to find reason, just as, and it's, so in one sense it's very reminiscent, one could say, of the history from below tradition that's contemporaneous with his work on the psychology of crowds, which was always to do with finding the reason beneath the apparent sort of feral relapse into, so E.P. Thompson and Hobsbawm and all of them, in a way their target is Le Bon and the late 19th century and the idea of the crowd as mad. But going back to this thing of the boundaries and Norman Cohn's and psychoanalysis and his retraction of the psychoanalytic elements of his work in later editions, I wanted to press you a bit on whether it's actually more internally contradictory than you might be allowing for, whether he is saying, like E.P. Thompson, there's a moral economy of the crowd, or whether it's somewhere more on the edge between wanting to recover that reasoning, but also wanting to sort of reinstate the passions or the unconscious or even the madness of groups back into the picture of a sort of something that sweeps through a group that can't simply be understood in terms of a reasoned response to given, contingent circumstance.
I think that's a very good, very perceptive set of observations, Daniel, that there is a sort of contradiction there. It's a contradiction. There's just always an ambivalence there, I think. And I mean, the notion of a reasoned response, I said when I uttered the word reason that it was my importation into what I think Norman Cohn put as a response which made sense to them, but also we can make sense of it. We can imagine ourselves into their situation, these immigrants lacking any kind of support in their new mushroom towns. We can imagine how they would have drawn certain inferences from their situation. In that sense, their response in forming the crowd that followed Tankhelm was reasoned. But and I think it's what Lorenzo's part of what you're talking about, and you use the word logic, that it kind of follows. But we could say, not sharing their religious views perhaps, that the whole thing was completely irrational. But I don't think, certainly not in the parts where he's talking about this earliest well-documented outbreak in Antwerp, he doesn't use the word irrational. He certainly uses it later on in talking about some much more violent, aggressive, the nasty side, I think, or at least I put that, something that Lorenzo said.
Yes.
The nasty side. That comes out later on. But so that's part of why I think that he didn't want to commit himself to unilaterally, to either of those views. But I may be, others will know much more about his other works.
So one here.
Yes, I'm not a historian, and my interest in Cohn's work was in work as someone who was exploring and examining the use of violence to clean up society, to for moral purposes, a thing that we find very difficult to get our heads around in reality. The idea that the terrorists who commit this atrocity actually believe that they are acting for high moral purposes. And talking to him a couple of years before he died, I asked him, and I thought this might be of interest to people, how he got interested in all this stuff. I don't know if any others here know the story, but he said, he was in intelligence during the war, just after the war, and he interviewed a KGB officer and an SS officer, actually some time apart, probably a year or so apart. And when he interviewed the SS officer said, I know we had to do terrible things, but we had to do them to clean up society. We were acting in a noble cause. When he interviewed the KGB officer said exactly the same thing. And it was that fired his interest.
But I asked the same question, you've got the same story.
It's interesting.
And it illuminated and to some extent confirmed many of my interpretations of Norman's work.
Yeah, but there's another piece to that series of stories. And Frank Chalk, for those of you who I haven't met, also from Concordia. And it was the encounter he had as well with a former member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, I think, and mentioned it to you as well, who had been slated to be executed during the purges, and was saved, and had the temerity to ask the executioner, essentially, well, why haven't you shot me? Why are you releasing me? And the chap replied, because we've reached our quota, which gives us the other side of this Janus-based process. Yeah, where there were, as we know, each district had its quotas during the purges, and it really didn't matter that much how the quotas were filled. And so he could also see that. I actually raised my hand earlier because I think a couple of themes have come out which resound among those of us who work in genocide studies currently, and really find a lot of resonance in the pursuit of Millennium, etc. I mean, first of all, I think Lorenzo did a very good thing when he pointed us to the significance of Zoroastrianism in Norman's work. It came late, as others were doing it, but if Zoroaster had not existed, let's say he didn't exist, Norman would have had to invent it in a sense. I should have also warned you there's a real danger, since we've had some references to cinema here, that when I speak, unlike those of you who are really toiling in the fields of the Middle Ages, etc., as a modern historian, instead of getting the Ingmar Bergman version, or even the Sunlight and Hot, you may get the Monty Python version. But we're debating right now in the Journal of Genocide Research and in Genocide Studies and Prevention, the two major journals in the field, the role of the state versus the systemic emergence of lethal mentalities. And it comes to a focus when we look at the annihilation of Native Americans in some areas, where Kurt Johnson and I have argued in our book that, in fact, there were really very few deliberate slaughters of Native American people organized by state agency, but rather there were many such killings that went on on the frontier, conflicts over resources, etc. And these were often considered legitimate by the surrounding population. And so people like Dirk Moses and others who see genocide largely as a colonial phenomenon or a consequence of colonialism, or emphasizing in the case of Australia, in the case of many other colonies and America, the role of individual initiative essentially driven by a society, Lorenzo and I would agree, a kind of societal Weltanschauung at the level of the frontier. At the same time, to conclude this remark, there there's a huge enthusiasm among my younger colleagues at Concordia in particular, where I see it, but elsewhere as well, to go back to the micro-studies that were done in American colonial history, in English history, etc., and to break everything apart, and break it down to individual communities. And those of us who remember what happened in American colonial history, the work of John Demos and others, are troubled by this to some degree, because the great synthesis never happened. It never took place. And so there are many areas that need their Norman Cohns, because, as several of you have already pointed out, all of us recognize, Norman had the capacity to bring together all that work, and sometimes do it himself to begin with, but also to take the work of others, and to develop it into a coherent and cogent picture, all the time realizing that he might have to modify it later on. I think that's one of his great legacies.
I'm aware that there are other questions, but I'm also aware that we're sort of at our 15-minute coffee and comfort break, and given the complexities of the comfort bit, I think we probably better not. So can we just thank our first speakers again for opening the day so